Welcome to Grow Virtually, an online horticultural educational program presented by the Master Gardener Volunteers of Cobb County. Under the guidance of the University of Georgia Cooperative Extension Service, we grow gardeners.
This evening, we will be discussing invasives and why you need to attend this session. This will be presented by Jeanette Lattimore. We'd like to go ahead and welcome our speaker, Cobb County Master Gardener Extension Volunteer, Gillette Lattimore.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Jeanette Lattimore. I'm a Master Garden Extension Volunteer, Cobb County, and I've been one since 2019. I believe that you are here tonight because of your interest was piqued when you read the focus of tonight's presentation on our website that states invasives, why you need to attend this presentation. Well, this evening, I will be presenting information on invasive plants in our Georgia landscape and try to convince you that we can live better without them. At the end of the presentation, I hope that you will agree that we can. As Master Gardeners, we are committed to growing educated gardeners, and with that as our focus, the educational objectives for this presentation are to have you leave with an understanding of what defines an invasive plant and learn to identify most common ones found in our area, which will allow you to more easily identify them in your landscape, in your community, and even in some nurseries where certain invasive plants continue to be sold. Additionally, we will look at why we should care about invasive plants because of their potential impact on our environment. We'll take a look at some of the top invasive plants in our Georgia landscape, and I will briefly share some alternative native plants to consider if you're looking to replace an invasive plant or you just want to purchase some native plants as you redesign your landscape. Now, keep in mind that I may only show you one or two alternative native plants, but there are many to choose from for every area of your landscape. So let's get started. For purposes of this presentation, 3 plant categories will be used. Native plants, such as the purple cone flower, which is a herbaceous, which basically means just a flexible green stem, perennial. Non-native, such as the hosta, that is an ornamental herbaceous perennial from Japan. And non-native invasive plant, as seen by the attractive mimosa tree. We're going to look a little closer at the first 2 categories to give you a better understanding of the third category. And after that, we'll spend most of our time on the non-invasive, non-native invasive plants, why they are harmful, and then look at some alternatives. The definition for a native plant can vary somewhat depending on the reference. We'll look at 3 definitions to think about. So native plants are those that are naturally occurring and said to be indigenous to an area, and they occur without any direct or indirect human intervention. There are also plants that have inhabited a region or ecosystem for hundreds or even thousands of years and were here prior to any European settlement. Even the Federal Register, which is the official journal of the government, has an official definition that states a native plant is one that naturally occurring either presently or historically in any ecosystem of the United States. Now, just for clarity, I want you to think of an ecosystem as an interconnected system of living elements, such as birds, insects, plants, and animals, and non-living elements, such as water, air, sunlight, soil, and temperature, all of those operating positively in an interdependent unit. So from that, we understand then that native plants have been here for a long time. So let's look at some of the benefits that they provide in an ecosystem where they naturally live. First, they provide a biodiverse habitat for our native insects, birds, pollinators, and wildlife. They also provide seeds, nectar, and fruits as a food source for them to thrive. Native plants are well adapted to the climate in their natural growing region, and they're low maintenance and self-sustaining. They're going to require little to no chemicals such as fertilizer and pesticides, which is good for our rivers and streams. And once they are established, they require less water. You may have actually noticed that in your own landscape where you have native plants growing. And lastly, I love this part. They actually provide a beautiful presentation as they reflect The natural landscape of the region, with their colorful flowers and fruits, the seasonal changes from colors of green in the summertime to yellow and orange in the fall. And I think this picture actually captures how healthy and balanced an ecosystem is when native plants are present. So while it's not shown here, we also know that leaves are also a feeding ground for caterpillars that may develop into butterflies. Non-native plants are those that did not exist historically in an area and have been brought to us from other regions or countries. These plants are considered exotic or imported. The hydrangea and the Lynchon rose, as shown in the picture, are here are examples of non-native plants. Now, we enjoy many non-natives in our landscape that don't pose a threat. And while they do support the ecosystem in some way, they cannot do it as well as a native plant. They typically are not host to as many insects, birds, and wildlife as they would be in their own natural habitat. So, as we enjoy a lot of these low threat, non native plants, we must be mindful that even too many of those can create an ecosystem that is not beneficial. Now that we understand the good native plants and the not so bad non-native plants, let's turn our attention then to the real focus of our time tonight, the bad boys, that is, the invasive plants. You might ask then, how does a plant get to be an invasive? There are 5 factors that play a role in a plant becoming an invasive. A plant has to be transported outside of its natural ecosystem, then introduced either by accident through ways such as soil, contaminated nursery material, through travel or some type of global trade, or it's actually introduced with intention for agricultural, forestry, or landscaping purposes. And we're familiar with that with kudzu. Once the invasive plant establishes itself to the point of self-sustaining, it can then spread and increase its range and ultimately creating a monoculture. It is at this point when the plant begins to impact the area by displacing the native plants and animal populations and subsequently causing harm to the environment and humans. This is when it's considered invasive. Now, we also have to consider the impact of climate change. Invasive plants tend to grow faster as temperatures increase, so they're going to germinate faster than the native plants in that area, producing more seeds for birds to carry to new areas, thereby increasing the spread. So as an ecosystem is changed either by natural or human intervention, it creates opportunities for invasive plants to grow. So why should we care about non-native invasive plants? If a plant is not native to an ecosystem, it can't provide the benefits of a biodiverse habitat that supports life. So basically, it upsets the local ecosystem. Your native insects, birds, and wildlife can't thrive because invasives do not provide the best food source. So they don't eat, they don't survive, and so it just kind of goes up the food chain. Berries of some of the invasives, such as the Nindina pictured here, may cause birds or animals to die when ingested. Native plants quickly displace spaces needed for invasive plants quickly displace spaces needed for native plants to grow. So when they're introduced in a new area, they don't really have any natural enemies, making it even easier, to spread, leading to these monocultures. Pesticides, if not used properly to destroy these invasives, can be harmful to water supply, not only for the birds, plants, and animals, but for us as humans. Soil nutrients can be depleted for native plants, and when sunlight is blocked, native plants can't carry out photosynthesis. So invasive plants can also sometimes actually change the chemistry of the soil, making it difficult for the native plant to grow in what used to be their natural environment. So I think as you see, there are many reasons we should care about how invasive plants can disrupt our ecosystem. The potential economic and environmental harm can be costly. And when native plants are no longer available because of invasive plants, our native insects, our birds, our wildlife will diminish, and some may even disappear. So with that understanding, let's look at some of the top invasives in our Georgia landscape. There's certainly more than we have time to discuss in this presentation, but I wanted to share ones that I thought you might see in your area. And as we look at these invasives, I'll provide information about the invasive plant, about steps how to remove it, and provide brief highlights on some alternative native plants that you might want to consider. Now, these invasives are just presented in alphabetical order primarily, because my top invasive may be different from the ones that you may be experiencing in your own landscape. What I do want you to notice, though, there are numbers, a number beside each plant, and that number actually represents the state category assigned to the invasive plant based on its level of harm or potential harm to the environment. Category 1 is a serious problem. Category 2 is moderate, but less than 1, all the way down to category 4, which is a plant that either has naturalized in Georgia or the potential for invasiveness is continuing to be determined. But I think you can see from the ones that we're going to be looking at that most of the plants I'll discuss are actually pose serious threats to our landscape here in Georgia. So let's look at our first invasive. We can't help but enjoy seeing the beautiful spring purple lavender flowers in April and May that look like grapevines, look like grapes hanging from a vine. Well, looks can be deceiving. The Chinese and the Japanese wisteria are beautiful, but they're problematic. These plants were brought to the United States from China and Japan in the 1800s as an ornamental plant. The vines were used to hang over gazebos, fences, porches, gardens, and walls. And while the plants look alike, there are some slight differences. The Chinese plant on the left has a small flower that creates a pendulous cluster or what's called racemes and compound leaves with multiple lobes, which are those little scallopy looking around the leaf. And the vine wraps or twines counterclockwise. The Japanese plant on the right has larger flowers creating its racemes, has a smoother compound leaves, and wraps clockwise. Both plants, though, bloom all at the same time in the spring, and each have a hairy pod that's shown in the picture here on the screen as well. However, what you're seeing, though, probably blooming is most likely will be the Chinese wisteria over the Japanese because that's the one the Chinese is more invasive. So, what actually makes them problematic? The vines actually girdle the trees, keeping nutrients from the plants that it needs to grow. Also, the tree foliage is covered and can't get sunlight, so photosynthesis cannot occur. And that results in the tree and the shrub eventually dying. You can see in the picture in the middle how the vines kind of run wild, displacing the vegetation. And it's shading the path of everything, all the plants that are in its path. Now, the plant spreads by roots, developing at the nodes on its running stems that kind of come, or by seeds that are dispersed in water. To remove wisteria, um, you might have to do that professionally, but now for some of your smaller problems, you can cut close to the base and treat it within 5 to 10 minutes with an herbicide like glyphosate. The vines that are running up the trees can actually be severed with a saw and just left to die on the tree. So you may ask, what do you do if you really like seeing the wisteria vine, those beautiful flowers? Well, all is not lost. Let's look at an alternative to the invasive wisteria. The American wisteria, it's a wonderful alternative for both the Chinese and the Japanese wisteria. As you can see, it has smaller racemes. The flowers are less fragrant, but just as beautiful, and the seed pods are smooth versus hairy. You can still enjoy the spring appearance because it blooms 3 weeks after the Asian wisteria, and it can be used on arbors, trellises, fences, and even walls. This climbing vine can actually grow up to about 40 feet, and it's also said to fix nitrogen in the soil, which can be beneficial in that less fertilizer is needed, especially if you're in an area where you have heavy nitrogen feeder plants also present. Now, going back to another invasive, the Chinese holly. It is commonly used by builders and homeowners for landscape projects. This is an evergreen plant that was brought to us from Asia for also its ornamental beauty. The plant is tolerant of most soils, meaning it can grow almost anywhere. It's well adapted to heat, humidity, and partial or full sun. It's used for tall hedges, screens, either as a shrub or a tree. Now, the flowers are dioecious, which means that each plant has either a male or a female flower. It's pollinated by bees, and then birds will eat those berries, which aid in spreading this fast growing plant. That shiny, dark, spiny leaves are horn shaped, which is the meaning of the specific epithet in the biological name, cornuta. The leaves are also thought to look like, at least to me, flying squirrels, at least for the rotunda cultivar that you see in the bottom left corner of the screen. But I think it's important that we know that this plant or these different cultivars is now naturalizing in our forest areas. So if you're looking to remove this invasive, you can easily uproot it if the stems are small. And if you don't want to use an herbicide, you can cut the plant back and leave it. However, just know that this method does require you to watch for new growth and prune that away to starve the root of nutrients, which will lead, to the root dying. And lastly, if you want to speed up the process, you can cut it back and apply glyphosate within like a 5 to 10 minute after you're cutting, because you want to make sure that the herbicide gets to the cambium layer, which is just under the bark. So while I just told you how to destroy that holly that you like, let's look at a native alternative to take its place. The American holly. It's a broadleaf evergreen tree with bright red berries in the winter that birds eat. The tree clippings actually have been used for Christmas decorations and as a screen in landscape. Mature trees can actually grow to 50 feet tall and as wide as 30 feet wide. Now, the leaves have this spiky teeth along their margins, and the tree itself can adapt to shade or full sun. Flowers on the female plant are fragrant. This plant is dioecious, so you're going to have both the male and female plant in the area in order to have those red berries produced. Now, let's go back to another invasive, the Chinese privet. It's very problematic, and this is one that was planted primarily for privacy, as a privacy hedge. It's difficult to eradicate once it's established. It overtakes the native plants, becoming a monoculture. It's more prevalent in our forest than kudzu, which is hard to believe that anything can exceed kudzu. It was brought to this country in the mid 1800s from Asia. Birds eat the drupes, which are just these fleshy fruit with a single stone in the middle that's housing the seed. And the birds spread the drupes, resulting in new plants, which can grow up to 30 feet tall when mature. Now, it also spreads by suckers that creates that thicket appearance. And when this invasive shrub has taken over, you won't see any young trees growing, just the covered old trees. And once those old trees die, you're left with the monoculture. The photos, I think, give you a good view of the leaves, the berries, and the flowers of the Chinese privet and how it's used as a shrub. The middle photo actually shows how the plant that was planted as a small shrub has overtaken a cypress and a magnolia tree. This one I get to see every day when I'm on a walk in my neighborhood. Now, removal is difficult, but mentioned with previous invasives, the options are to cut it and leave it, watching for new growth to be pruned. You can uproot the small suckers or just cut it and treat it with glyphosate. Now, there's some wonderful native alternatives, and we're going to look at two of them for you to consider. The sweet pepper bush, also known as summer sweet, it's a deciduous shrub, so you're going to lose leaves in the fall, but it grows 5 to 10 feet. It presents with small white flowers in late summer and provides nectar and pollen for the hummingbirds, butterflies, bees, and other pollinators. In the fall, though, a brown dry capsule is actually formed that provides seeds for birds. The Piedmont azalea is a large woody deciduous shrub, and actually found on the underside of the leaves are gray or off-white hairs, which is the meaning of the specific epithet kinesis in its botanical name. The flowers are fragrant, attracting bees, butterflies, and hummingbirds. And I hope you're noticing that as we're talking about these native alternatives, just the benefit that they provide in our ecosystem. We're going to go back to another invasive. You don't have to look far to see English ivy covering the grounds of flower beds, climbing trees and walls. It's very aggressive. It's a very aggressive evergreen vine. And interestingly, it can actually capture the wind under its cell-like leaves at the trunk, making the tree weak over time. And under the right storm conditions, along with the weight of the vine, it can actually cause the tree to fall. So just know that if you're planting this in your yard, you're also planting it in your neighbor's yard. English ivy produces berries in late winter to spring that the birds eat, spreading the vine in other areas as well. And once it's established, it's difficult to remove. Now, if you really want to enjoy English ivy, it's actually suggested that you grow it indoors in a pot where it can help clean the air due to its ability to remove air pollutants. As far as removal, you can hand pull the roots for, new growth, but more aggressive measures are needed for older vines. And if the vine is climbing the tree, you can sever the vine on the tree and just leave it there to die. Then, if you want to completely or try to get rid of it, you can also cut low to the ground and apply herbicide within 5 to 10 minutes after cutting. Removal of English ivy can be time consuming, but it can be very effective if it's done properly the first time. So now we're going to look at two native alternatives in terms of ground covers that you might want to consider. The first one is the Allegheny spruce. It's a native plant that forms dense mats and it grows about 2 to 4 inches tall under trees or shrubs. It has a fragrant bloom in the spring and it provides an evergreen ground cover. You can prune it as needed to remove any sort of dead growth. That green and gold plant is a low growing perennial that grows 1 to 2 inches tall in part shade to full sun. It spreads up to about 18 inches by rhizomes, which are kind of like underground stems that send roots and shoots up from its nodes. The growth rate is moderate to rapid, and you do get small gold flower blooms in the springtime. Those spent flowers can actually be removed for better ground cover appearance if you like. Let's go back now to another invasive, heavenly bamboo, which most often we call it just Nandina. It's an evergreen shrub that has been sold in nurseries since as far back as 1837, and it's still a popular plant today, used in landscape for its interesting leaves and its red berries. It flowers in the spring and the berries appear in the fall through winter. Now, the plant was brought to from China and Japan for, again, ornamental reasons, but unfortunately, those bright, beautiful red berries are toxic to birds and cause hemorrhaging, leading to death. It spreads by root sprouts and animal dispersed seeds, and it's a problem in that it's spreading into our forest areas. So you may want to consider an alternative to this shrub before purchasing it. As far as removal, your small plants can be uprooted. And if you can't uproot, the best option really is to just cut and treat it with glyphosate. While the cut and leave is an option, it does require, as I said, follow-up pruning the new growth until that root dies. And if you do use that option, you probably want to at least remove the red berries and discard those in your lawn refuse so that birds can't get to those and eat them. So what do we have to replace it? Now, given that heavenly bamboo is an evergreen shrub, you may want to consider inkberry. You get red berries produced in the fall that require both the male and the female plant, as this evergreen is also dioecious. Birds and small mammals eat these berries, and you get a greenish white flower in the spring that attracts honeybees and butterflies. Another invasive, Japanese honeysuckle. It was introduced from Japan in the 1800s. You may think that it's native because it's just so prevalent. In fact, it is the fifth most commonly observed invasive plant in the country. The vine forms dense mats on the ground and can cover small trees and shrubs, depriving them of sunlight. It can girdle small saplings by twining around them. It is fast growing and it invades canopies, wetlands, roadsides, forest floors, and disturbed areas. This one photo shows a vine taking over a magnolia tree, another one in my neighborhood that I get to see on my walks. Now, removal, the vine itself is not very thick on the ground, so you can actually find the root. You can uproot it kind of one vine at a time, trying to minimize the damage to your tree or your shrub that you're trying to keep. You can use hand pruners to unwrap the young trees that are covered with the vine. And you want to make sure that you remove the soil from the roots so that they can just dry out and die. And then there's another picture here, just a close-up of what the flower looks like. Now, while we can't have a yellow flower, we can have a different color because we can have an alternative for the Japanese honeysuckle, which is a coral honeysuckle. It's a vigorous twining evergreen vine that can be used to replace it. It can reach up to 10 to 20 feet and spread 3 to 6 feet wide. It flowers in mid-spring and it's non-fragrant, but beautiful just the same. This evergreen attacks butterflies and hummingbirds. While it tolerates shade, you're going to get your best flowers if it's in full sun. It's great for trellises, arbors, fences, and also as a ground cover. While it's not pictured here, two other alternatives is the yellow jasmine and the crossvine, just some others that you might want to think about. Well, we couldn't do this presentation without it. Kudzu is actually a Category 1 invasive, which is probably not a surprise. It's known as the plant that ate the South, but I think that we could probably change that it's the plant that's continuing to eat the South. Um, it grows up 100 feet. It covers everything in its path, tree canopy, shrubs, houses, as you see, and anything else. It literally shades trees and plants from sunlight, and kudzu is extremely fast growing and can grow a foot in a day. It keeps growing along the ground, developing more roots from the nodes on those runners that come in contact with the soil. It also spreads by wind, water, and animal dispersed seeds. Now, the leaves, flowers, and roots are actually eaten in some countries, but not here in the US, at least not that we're aware of. It was first introduced in the United States during the Philadelphia Centennial Exposition in 1876 as a great ornamental plant, and it was later introduced intentionally in the South from the 1930s through the 1950s to help solve erosion during poor farming practices. And if you're familiar with Providence Canyon Park, State Park, also known as Georgia's Little Grand Canyon in Lumpkin, Georgia, you can understand why kudzu was thought to be a good solution. While kudzu is no longer planted, it remains difficult to get rid of because it grows fast. And so removal often requires professional help. You can cut and treat it with a very strong concentration of glyphosate within 5 to 10 minutes after cutting because you want to ensure that that wound doesn't dry up, preventing that herbicide from absorbing. Goats and sheep have actually been used to clear large areas before the cut and treat method have been used. Those vines that are on the tree, you can just actually sever those and just leave them on the tree and those will eventually die. Just have to keep in mind that well-established roots make getting rid of kudzu very difficult because those roots are just a huge energy source for the plant. So that itself is a problem. Now, I did not list an alternative for kudzu. The best thing is to just get rid of it if you can. And I say that only because it's most likely that if it's in your landscape, it's going to be in a rough area, running on the ground and up in the trees, shading the canopy. So getting rid of it will allow your trees to live and thrive in their natural area and allow more nutrients to remain in the soil for those plants native to the area in order for them to survive. Leatherleaf mahonia is an invasive evergreen shrub that was brought to us from Asia for its unusual ornamental appeal. This can grow 5 to 10 feet, and it continues to be purchased by unsuspecting homeowners for landscaping projects. Those grape-like berries appearing in the summertime, they start out green and then they turn like a bluish black. They're eaten by birds, which play a role in actually spreading the shrub. This plant is not a good source for native insects. which make up a large portion of food, for our birds. It provides a yellow, fragrant flower in the winter, and it's deer resistant, most likely due to those spiny, holly-like leaves that you see here pictured. Now, as a Category 3 invasive, you're going to find this plant invading woodlands in Georgia and in other southern states. So it can grow in a variety of soils and light conditions. So we may be seeing even more of that. Leatherleaf mahonia is difficult to remove because it has a deep tap root and a brittle stem. So the best removal is to cut it and treat it with an herbicide. And if you're using an herbicide, or if that's not your choice, you may want to cut it and leave it to die. You just need to know that you're going to have to, prune those roots, prune those that new growth in order to starve the root. So what do we have in place of it? The wax myrtle. It's an ornamental evergreen. It's a great source of food for birds. They actually love the berries and they like making their nest in this dense shrub. It's quick growing and it responds well to pruning. It tolerates different soil conditions and can grow in full sun to shade. Now, the foliage and the berries are fragrant, which is nice. The catkins or flower clusters, as they are, present first, and then that's followed by the berries. This shrub also is dioecious and requires both a male and a female plant to produce those berries. An interesting fact, though, those berries are actually covered with a thick wax, and it's actually been used in candle making. Another invasive, and I love this tree, but it's an invasive. The mimosa tree, those flowers, it flowers in the springtime with those pink pom-pom, fragrant flowers in this fern-like foliage. It's also known as the silk tree. It's hard to believe that a plant, this tree is classified as a Category 1 invasive plant in Georgia. The tree reproduces these 5-inch seed pods at a rapid rate and outgrows everything in the area. In addition to spreading by seed, it also spreads by root sprouts, making it difficult to remove. Now, if you notice where these trees are located, you're going to find them appearing in areas where the land has been disturbed, such as old fields and roadsides. And I don't mean roadsides necessarily in the country. If you're driving down some of the main connections here in Cobb County, you'll see them. The mimosa tree was brought to us in the US in the 1700s from Asia as an ornamental and was actually used in China, Chinese medicine for depression. Removal methods are going to be the same as we mentioned before with some of the others. If you have a mimosa tree in your landscape that you want to remove, you can cut it close to the ground and apply an herbicide and also uproot any young trees. And again, after you cut it and leave it, just watch for that new growth because we have to make sure that we're continuing to starve the root in order to get rid of it. But we do have a replacement, uh, a native alternative. And one example here is the red buckeye. It's a deciduous ornamental tree, meaning that it's going to lose its leaves in the fall. It can be a tree or shrub. It blooms in the spring and it attracts hummingbirds and butterflies. After about a month, the flowers are actually followed by a 1 to 3 inch, 3-part, shiny brown seed that's enclosed in a smooth husk, and that's shown here in the picture. Now, while the seeds are not edible by humans, squirrels love them. So by September, the leaves start to turn red, and then between the leaves, the stem, and the fruit on the ground, it can certainly mean a little more cleanup for you, especially if you don't have squirrels in your yard. But we live in Georgia, so who doesn't have squirrels in their yard? Um, our next invasive is the periwinkle. It's a vine-like perennial broadleaf trailing ground cover. It's used in a lot of homeowners' gardens. This was introduced in the 1700s as an ornamental plant from Europe. The biggest difference, we're talking here now about both the Vinca minor and the major, and the biggest difference between the minor and the major is just the size of primarily the size of the flower and how they are classified um, in Georgia as invasive. Now we're going to see the Vinca minor poses the most threat because it has a state category of 1 for its invasiveness compared to a 4 for the Vinca major. The plants are mostly evergreen as seen in the photo, but you may see some variegated ones as seen in the photo on the right here. Flowers bloom in the springtime and they run late into summer, attracting bumblebees. Now, the problem with the periwinkle, especially the vinca minor, is that these vines grow vigorously by rooting through nodes that form these dense mats, and so they displace our native woody herbaceous plants. You may find them near old homesteads and forest floors, and perhaps in your own landscape because they continue to be sold in nurseries as ground covers. But other choices you may want to consider for, to replace this invasive plant. To remove it, you can primarily remove it by hand. You might want to take a rake and just kind of rake the area to get it started, kind of clear it and to loosen up the soil for better access to the roots. But we do have some alternative natives that we want to look at. There are three: the creeping phlox, the woodland phlox, and the partridge berry. Now, the creeping phlox is a perennial ground cover. It tolerates full sun to part shade. It spreads rapidly, forming these dense mats as roots form from the nodes and the above ground leafy stems. Butterflies are highly attracted to them. The flowers may present either as pink, blue, white, lavender, depending on the cultivar. Your woodland attracts pollinators such as butterflies, bees, and moths as well, and they also visit for the pollen and the nectar. Now, it flowers from April to May with colors that are mirroring the creeping, um, and the plant is planted in part sun to full shade, and you'll see the foliage here. It's sort of a semi-evergreen and low growing. The mats are formed over time, and it's also spread by seeds. The partridge berry is an evergreen herbaceous perennial. The stems grow vine-like, low to the ground, and flowers in the summer. Now, this plant creeps, so it's slow. So it's kind of recommended that if you're going to use this, you may want to use it for a smaller area, just based on that. If you're trying to get a larger area covered, you may want to look at the other two. And we have come to our last invasive for tonight, and this is the silverthorn, also known as the thorny olive. It was brought to the United States from China and Japan in the 1930s as an ornamental plant. It remains a popular plant used by landscapers and homeowners. Now, the silverthorn is a state one category. It's a state category one invasive problem because it can thrive in the harshest of conditions, and it can now be seen in open areas and under forest canopies. It's an evergreen that you can easily identify by that silver leaf that's shown here on the picture. And it is densely branched and often grows like a vine, which increases the size. Now, the shoots are sharp, giving it that thorny appearance, but they're actually not thorns. It flowers from October to December, and then it produces a berry, a fruit, as you can see in the picture here from March to June, which is actually edible by humans. Although it's thought to be, those berries are, that fruit thought to be deadly for some birds, they do play a role in spreading the plant through those berries. Now, from the photo, you can see that the silverthorn planted you can see different variations. It's planted in a pot. We see it growing wild, and then we see it manicured as a privacy hedge. To remove it, you can uproot the small plants that are less than 3 inches in diameter. And if you choose to cut and leave it, again, just remember you have to follow up with that new growth. For the very mature plants, though, the cut and treat may be the best option. The thorny branches, actually, if you're going to do that, you probably want to prune those first to make it a little easier for handling. An alternative for that is the wax myrtle. Now, I discussed this earlier as an alternative to the leatherleaf mahonia. Again, it is an ornamental evergreen with a great source of food for the birds. And, like I said, they love the berries, they love to nest in the shrub. But I wanted you to see that if you're looking for an evergreen shrub or privacy hedge, the photo shows you that a wax myrtle that's manicured in a formal trim, because as I mentioned earlier, that it responds well to pruning. So in summary, our non-native invasives are really a real threat to our ecosystem. And it may not seem like that when we see them. It's like, oh, they're pretty, but they are over time. And correcting the invasive plant problem can be costly. And so we need to think about, what we're doing to actually contribute to that when we purchase them. Invasive removals can take some effort, but again, it can be very effective. Our native plants have many benefits, as you saw, as we talked about, as I discussed the alternative native plants. They preserve our native insects, our butterflies, our birds, and our wildlife. And they are actually great substitutes for both the non-native ornamentals and our invasives. And I think we want to also leave here knowing that we need to make sure we understand what it is that we're purchasing from the nursery so that we avoid invasives, that are sold. And what I'd like to leave you with now, if you want to explore this a little further, there's some resources here that you might want to look at. These will actually be sent to you, as mentioned earlier, within a few days. And that concludes my presentation on invasive plants in our Georgia landscape.
We hope that you will find our information informative and helpful. Thanks for watching, and please remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel.